Wilfred Mellors here.
What is experimental music?
Music that is trying to define what music might be.
It's to do with, obviously, with pushing back the boundaries.
Particularly in the 1960s.
And the motivation for the sounds is more important than the final result.
Composers giving up a little bit of their power to the performer.
But it's more an attitude than a style.
Did you say chance?
So something might happen that is potentially more beautiful than something that the composer could have planned, and that's where the experiment comes in.
Although the term experimental music is specifically used to describe groups of American and British composers working during the 1960s, experimenting with music is nothing new. Throughout history, musicians have improvised in search of new and unexpected sounds. In the 18th century, there was even a game of chance attributed to Mozart, which used throws of the dice, a numerical grid, and a numbered list of musical bars to compose new waltzes entirely at random. During the course of this program, the contributors will help us to compose a brand new, never-before-performed waltz using Mozart's method.
I'm very puzzled by those dice.
$11. Moving forward 2 centuries, the experimental music movement began to develop in the 1950s as a reaction to strictly notated serial compositions of European composers like Boulez and Stockhausen, the so-called Darmstadt school, whose rigorous and complex scores indicated every note, rhythm, and dynamic with merciless and mathematical precision, and left many players feeling that they were wearing a musical straitjacket every time they performed.
If you look at some of the very complex scores, you see the composers almost becoming more and more dictatorial or oppressive. Every note has its own performing nuance, its own expressive nuance. So in order to prepare a performance of a score like that, you would have to practice for hours and hours and hours.
However, unlike traditional music, most experimental music was written in free notation, using graphs, pictures, chance procedures, sometimes just written instructions with no notes at all.
Well, this was a very refreshing thing, that instead of the score telling one in a rather forbidding sort of way, set the metronome to 182.5 and play properly. Instead of that, there were these much more liberating kind of graphic scores and instructions, like blue touch paper here kind of pieces, that was expressly there to inspire the performer rather than to limit him.
It's a kind of meta music, and where
The actual physical, concrete aspect of sound is not there at all. They're just references to it.
These freedoms included, in some cases, more graphical notation, so it was impossible to play the score the same twice over because there wasn't a written down sequence of precise notes.
Each time the piece is played, depending on the circumstances, depending on the who's playing it, the identity of the piece changes. So it's a kind of perpetual identity crisis for an indeterminate piece of music.
The godfather of the experimental music movement was John Cage.
Experimental music is, for me, it's the music that follows on from John Cage, definitely.
I think it's to do with the relationship between Pierre Boulez and John Cage. Yeah, they were good friends in the 50s.
And Boulez went in one direction and Cage went in the other direction.
While Europeans like Boulez were seeking ever greater control over the music, Cage was fascinated by chance and encouraged the random juxtaposition of events in his music. He often composed pieces by tossing coins and consulting the I Ching, and regarded even the act of listening to a record as a potential performance.
If, as you have the record playing in your room, your attention goes to something other than it, then the superimposition of those two things may produce an activity which has the character of originality.
Yeah, for Cage, he was trying to get away from the material itself. He didn't want his ego or his taste or any part of him to be reflected in the music. He believed that sounds were sounds were sounds. They had a life of their own.
Cage took this philosophy to its logical conclusion in his most famous piece, the completely silent 4 minutes 33 seconds. Originally not played on piano, but not played here by a full orchestra.
The silent piece came about not because he wanted to write a silent piece, that's 4 minutes 33 seconds, but because he cast the I Ching, and the I Ching instructed him to write a piece that had no music in it.
Cage's approach to music and life was seriously playful.
Dr. John Cage.
becoming a doctor makes you feel better already.
That playful approach can be seen in his creation of the prepared piano, which he invented while trying to make a grand piano sound more percussive and African.
And so I went into the kitchen and I got a pie plate and I put it on the strings. And I saw I was going in the right direction, but the pie plate bounced around. So then I got a nail and it slipped. And finally I got a wood screw, you know, the grooves on it, and it stayed in position, and I was able to repeat from one moment to the next the sound as it was transformed by that insertion of the wood screw. And then I put nuts that were larger than the screws themselves so that they would rattle. And then I thought of putting weather stripping under the first string, over the middle one, and under the third. And that made a nice correspondence to the first sound, which was more bell-like. For some reason, I knew that it was better not to have a collection that was entirely beautiful, but that it was nice to have some things in the collection that were distinctly not as beautiful as the others. And that gave a kind of breadth.
By the start of the 1960s, the work of Cage and other experimentalists like Lamont Young had begun to influence young American composers who were tired of serialism and wanted to make a freer music. And on the West Coast, composers were open to a host of multicultural influences from African drumming to Oriental gamelan orchestras, and they began returning to tonality.
Tonality
never really went away because it is a fact of nature invented by God.
That was another thing. Although to keep tonality, calling this kind of music that keeps tonality as being experimental seems a bit of a misnomer. It's more like traditional, but there you go. The problem of definition.
In 1964, an experimental musician in California composed one of the simplest pieces ever written, and in doing so, hit upon a new form of music: minimalism.
When I showed it to the first few friends I showed it to, everybody kind of laughed and thought it was really a silly idea. But just a little bit later than that, a few weeks later, Morton Subotnick called me up and asked me to do a solo concert, and I'd never been thinking about doing a concert of my own music. And so immediately I thought, well, this will be a place to try the NC idea out. So I called all my friends that played any kind of instrument, anybody I knew at all in San Francisco, and we put together about 20 musicians and gave the first performance in, I think it was November 4th, 1964 at the Tate Music Center.
With minimalism, you've got the idea of open-endedness. I mean, in theory, the music can go on forever. Take a piece like Terry Riley's In C. In theory, it can go on forever.
In C consists of a series of simple, repeating patterns, and each musician moves gradually through the score at their own speed from bar 1 to bar 53. The result is a continually shifting kaleidoscope of sound, with every performance being unique. hers in the first performance of In C was Steve Reich, who soon developed his own form of minimalism, inspired by his work with tape loops.
I had to, like, open the bruise up and let some of the bruise blood come out to show them, 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 come out.
It's a tape piece. It uses the voice of a black kid who was arrested for murder.
Show them, come out to 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 show them, come out.
And I was approached by a man by the name of Truman Nelson, who said he understood that I did something with tape, and would I be willing to edit this pile of tapes he had of boys, police, mothers, and so on and so forth for a benefit. And out of this stack of audio tape lasting maybe 10 hours, I heard this one phrase come out to show them, dee-dum, ba-da-dum, which just sort of grabbed my ear and said, that's the one.
Show them, come out, 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 show them, come out.
The first, and I would say probably the most important bridging that happened was in a piece called Piano Phase, where in 1967, in really desperation, the desperation of, let us say, a mad scientist trapped in the laboratory, I felt this tape thing can't be done by people. Somebody can't get in unison with another repeating pattern and gradually increase his speed till he's one beat ahead of it. That's indigenous to tape recorders. People can't do that. But on the other hand, I felt this is a fantastic process. This is a very interesting way to make music.
Reich began a series of experimental pieces based on shifting and repeated rhythmic patterns, culminating in his famous clapping music.
I certainly think there's a very strong relationship between minimalism and experimentalism, because there's the same desire to make music clearer and less complex. And certainly in works like In C and a lot of Steve Reich's music, you can really hear the music unfolding. You can hear every system that's in it is very, very clear.
The freedom enjoyed by West Coast and New York musicians in the early 1960s was in sharp contrast to the stuffiness and claustrophobia of British musical life.
What people don't realise, I think, forget about the 60s, that actually a lot of the 60s were very much like the 50s. It was extremely conservative. People forget that the Lady Chatterley's lover court case was actually in the 60s. It was in 61, wasn't it? Extraordinary when one thinks of it.
But rebellious young British composers and art students were becoming increasingly anti-establishment in their outlook, rejecting the rigidity of serial composition in favour of experimental music.
It seems to me that the best definition I can manage is it's quite political, I think, and quite anti-establishment. And I can understand very much why a group of composers would feel the need to start being anti-establishment, because I still find that the world of particularly classical music in England is extremely conservative. Much as they try not to be, it still is.
An unlikely source of inspiration for British experimentalists was Yoko Ono. In the early 1960s, she lived in New York, where she belonged to the experimental music group Fluxus. Known as the High Priestess of the Happening, she composed pieces that didn't contain notes, just general instructions to performers like, listen to the sound of the earth turning. When she came to London in the mid-60s, she influenced not only pop music, but also a young composer who soon became the leading figure in British experimental music, Cornelius Cardew.
I think he was a bit influenced by performance art. In a way, the Scratch Orchestra was very early performance art. But I think he met people like Yoko Ono briefly. I think he'd read her book Grapefruit, and I expect he'd met other people of that kind. And then when he went to New York, he met her.
After working with Stockhausen in the early 60s, Cardew rebelled against serialism and became attracted to the free experimental techniques of Cage and Ono. In 1965, he joined the free improvisation group AMM.
I got involved with experimental music in the early 60s. I was a jazz bass player and free improvising bass player, and then I got interested in the work of Cage and others, and started to compose and became interested in that way of working. I got in touch in England with people in the experimental music world there. Especially Cornelius Cardew. I contacted him, I think, in about 65 or so.
Well, I worked with Cornelius on all sorts of projects from about the middle 60s onwards. First of all, because I was a tuba player, and Cornelius was really looking for people who played traditional instruments but who had interest in an experimental approach to music.
Right. Well, I was a performer, and I was
like some people like of my generation, inquiring, restless young souls that we were. We got interested in the new trends, new tendencies, and so forth. And so, I almost inevitably found myself consorting with people like Cardew.
Cardew and his colleagues, a new way to composing began to emerge, completely unlike any traditional British approach.
In the late 1960s, Cardew founded his most important experimental music group, a mixture of musicians and non-musicians called the Scratch Orchestra.
Yes, the program is different. Why? Each program is different. Why? Why is that?
But why Scratch?
Well, I think that it came from the Scratch Orchestra that's got together on an ad hoc situation for an emergency. There is a term in music, isn't there?
If you look at the Scratch Orchestra, there were people who were visual artists, people who were trained composers, trained performers, you had bank clerks, you had shop assistants, you had students, and young people and even children.
In the Scratch Orchestra, we always seemed to have a large audience because we were a large orchestra, so we would bring along friends and to boost the numbers. With Cardew and the Scratch Orchestra, I mean, we made music with tax inspectors, traffic wardens, students, the unemployed. these were our musical colleagues.
So I think the mindset was simply an openness and an excitement, because Cardew was just allowing people to be creative. He was sort of creating a forum where people could have creative input, which isn't that easily come by, actually. So I think people valued that very much.
These experimental musicians shunned the musical establishment, and in return, the musical establishment shunned them. While new works by avant-garde composers like Stockhausen and Boulez were treated with respect, the experimentalists of the 60s were largely ignored.
In the 60s, we had audiences of about 30, 20, 10 sometimes. Sometimes there were more people in the performing group than the audience, so it's not the sort of thing that was disturbing the public very much. We had a sort of core audience.
I performed to audiences where there were less more on the stage than there were in the hall. So the audiences were pretty baffled by a lot of it, I think. But there was a sort of quite healthy spirit. I mean, we were not kind of high priests for new music. We were doing things in a rather kind of gentle and sometimes ironic way.
While Americans like Cage had a playful and energetic approach to experimental music, the British initially seemed more earnest and serious about what they were doing.
Very earnest, that's a very good word. I think Cornelius had a very calm, and he was very keen on integrity. I don't think he was a kind of jokey, pub-like person, He didn't joke around with the lads at all.
Yes, I think that there was a kind of high gloss on American experimental music. There's a feeling of the music being a part of a culture that had produced the Jackson Pollocks, the Rothkos, the people who are doing sort of new things on rather kind of big and expansive scale. Whereas I think that Cornelius Cardew and those of us who kind of clustered around him had a far more sort of low-flying approach, a very English approach.
There's more tea and biscuits in the British approach, I think.
Yet beneath the apparent humorlessness, a jokey undercurrent began to develop.
There are all of these pieces that involved toy robots and blowing up balloons and shaving cream all over the place. There's quite a feeling of, Harrod's toy shop about the whole thing.
I think you had to approach it seriously, although, I did one of Core's pieces on a balloon, because it said hold a long note. I was the person who had to hold the long note while other things happened around me, so I performed it on a balloon, which gave rise to hilarity.
But the performers of experimental music are dedicated. There's a task to be done. They perform the music to the best of their ability, and they get on with it. They're not taking the mickey.
Although he was never a member of the scratch orchestra,
Gavin Bryars was closely associated with the experimental music movement. That free approach to music making can be heard in his 1969 composition, The Sinking of the Titanic.
Well, the original version of the piece actually was a little sketch, which was actually written for an exhibition at Portsmouth Art College where I was teaching. And so I had this, I wondered about what could be a conceptual piece of music, and I made this sketch for The Sinking of the Titanic, which is based on just what would happen to the music as the band were playing and it goes under the water. And it was based on just the last 5 minutes of the ship sinking as the band played this hymn.
The British experimentalists' unique blend of seriousness and humour is typified by the music of David Bedford, such as his extraordinary With 100 Kazoos.
The deal was that the first 100 members of the audience who came in were given a kazoo. It was a commission for Pierre Boulez for a roundhouse prom. The actual prescription was have a piece with audience participation. So I did that, and there's a graphic score which the players are given, the audience are given as they enter, and there are various times in the score where the audience are asked to join in with the players. You know, simple stuff. You can do it even if you can't read music. There's a picture of a motorbike, or there's a picture of a solar system, which the audience are asked to interpret on their kazoos. However, I'd misinterpreted the deal. The deal of audience participation actually was that at the concert there was a perforated slip at the bottom of the programme where you could write a question for Boulez and pass it to the end of your row. He looked at them in the interval and then answered the ones he wanted to answer at the end, and that was the audience participation. So
He refused to conduct this piece, and it was
withdrawn from the concert and received its premiere in Canada, which was very nice.
Obscure and esoteric though it was, experimental music had an influence on popular music of the period, from the Beatles to Roxy Music.
I don't know, things like Roxy Music and Brian Eno, there's a lot of music that, Frank Zappa even, that has the same sort of irony and eclecticism and electronics that were being used in experimental music. So there is certainly an area of crossover there, yeah.
There are some areas of experimental music which affected some musicians. Brian Eno, for example, went to art college and was around experimental music when he was a student, and that affected his approach, and later he paid some kind of homage to that by issuing a series of recordings called Obscure Records. The Who maybe were a little bit interested. They were art college people too, the Beatles.
Yeah, but I think more importantly, a phenomenon like minimalism undoubtedly had an influence on techno music and dance music.
In America, by the early 70s, minimalism had proved to be the most successful and durable form of experimental music. Indeed, minimalist composers like Steve Reich and Philip Glass gradually stopped being regarded by the musical establishment as experimental and became part of the mainstream. In Britain too, the early 70s was the high point for experimentalists, notably with Gavin Bryar's most famous composition.
Well, Jesus Blood is slightly later, it's 1971. Both those pieces, Jesus Blood and the Titanic, did grow entirely out of the experimental music world, and my approach to making those pieces was entirely consistent with the way we did things. Jesus Blood was a kind of found object in the sense that I came across, and completely by accident, this voice of an old man singing a fragment of a religious hymn. It was on a piece of tape which was actually going to be thrown away, and I happened to listen to it and retained it. I made a loop and gradually added an accompaniment, and that was the piece. Essentially, it gets more and more complicated in a way, but it's as simple as that. In the end, the power of the piece lies, I think, in the power of the old man's voice, rather than anything I do with it. I just try and treat it respectfully.
Jesus' blood never found me yet, never found me yet. Jesus' blood never found me yet. This one thing I know, for he loved me Cage's blood never found me yet, never found me yet. Jesus' blood never found me yet. This one thing I know, for he died so. Jesus' blood never found me yet, never found me yet. Jesus' blood never found me yet. This one thing I know, for he died so. Jesus' blood never found me yet, never found me yet. Jesus' blood never found me yet. This one thing I know, for he died so. Jesus' blood.
In a sense, Jesus' Blood is a kind of a piece which grows out of the experimental music world, and certainly that's something which we did at that time.
In 1972, the British experimental movement reached its zenith.
The biggest change in terms of what I observed was 1972 was a really bumper year, and all the British musicians were travelling to the continent 2, 3, 4 times over the summer. And for various reasons that was an exception, but then the next year we had the beginnings of the oil crisis, and funding just got that much less.
We have from the singers of the Progressive Cultural Association a song which has been especially written for this occasion.
By now, many musicians started to feel that the movement had run its course and cracks began to appear. Some, led by Cornelius Cardew, became intensely political and abandoned what they saw as bourgeois music in favour of writing socialist workers' songs.
It split the group of people that Core was connected with. And some went away and made efforts to look political. Some denounced it and abandoned any idea of socialist ideals and continued pure sound, pure form music, experimental, and the rest joined Core. Cornelius in writing for the political movements.
Well, that's when I withdrew from that particular aspect, the scratch orchestra. I'm not a Maoist or whatever Cornelius was, and I just couldn't go with it, you know. So I gave up then. And I think he did lose a lot of credibility when he went into that.
I think, you know, Cardew's idea of opening up scores and opening up performance possibilities to amateurs was all to do with almost like a Confucian aesthetic, really, guiding people by example rather than telling them that you didn't like what they were doing. But of course that did split up the scratch orchestra.
Well, I jumped ship when politics became a big issue, because I'd worked with Cornelius and I'd worked with the scratch orchestra because of the proliferation of what seemed to me very sparky ideas. And there was something rather sort of dictatorial, a new kind of dictatorship that came up regarding the left-wing politics that the scratch orchestra embarked on. And a few of us jumped ship.
Politics didn't undermine it. It sort of diversified it, and Cornelius was a friend right to the end. So although we went different ways musically, I mean, the politics moved it into a different direction, because clearly the music had to be more accessible and less kind of bizarre if it was going to work in this political way.
But Cage never got to that, I think. I mean, he balked, I think, at the implications of his musical philosophy. Cardew actually went through it and went into social collective music making with radical consequences. But Cage, I think, balked at that. He never could take that step.
Other British composers turned to irony, such as John White with his drinking and hooting machine.
Oh yes, the drinking and hooting machine. I left the scratch orchestra because of all sorts of political implications that were blowing up like a dark cloud, and I got back into writing a kind of alternative to the American minimalists' work. I was working for Bulmer's in one of their administrative offices at the time, and I got the use of several crates of this dietary cider, and while trying to think of a good musical use for it, it suddenly occurred to me about blowing notes across the tops of bottles and how to alter the pitch by taking a small swig or large gulp. And so all of this is laid out in a very pedantic sort of way for the performers, and we finished the first performance all as high as kites on dietary cider, my goodness.
The most famous foray into irony was perhaps the greatest glory of the entire British experimental movement, the Portsmouth Sinfonia.
The Portsmouth Symphony was a real breath of fresh air at the time. I mean, Gavin Bryce went down there with a brief to lecture the students at the Fine Arts department, and instead of playing them movements from Beethoven's symphony and pointing out what was the exposition, etc., he got them all to buy instruments and got them to play standard classics to the best of their ability.
The intention of that, though I was never involved in it, was to open up music to people who hadn't really mastered an instrument necessarily, and then they interpreted sort of classical repertoire, and the interest to the listener came from all the mistakes and the wrong notes played. So it's a way of perverting, distorting familiar music that sometimes in other contexts composers would do very seriously.
That was such a beautiful moment. Capital Radio used to wake me up for me to go to my paper round, and I had heard the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra with their Hooked on Classics and been disgusted and upset and everything, with the clap track going all the way through it on the offbeat. And then I was woken up by Capital Radio, and there was this beautiful, raucous, atonal thing by the Portsmouth Sinfonia, which they called a classical modly. And even better, halfway through, the clap goes, in order to fit in with the Blue Danube, it goes into 3/4, but really awkwardly and wrongly. I just fell out of bed with joy. So really, that's a great moment in music for me.
What was the legacy of the experimentalists? Well, they made tonality and simplicity respectable again in classical music, as highly regarded composers like Michael Nyman have proved. And without minimalism, would techno music ever have developed?
A phenomenon like minimalism undoubtedly had an influence on techno music and dance music. I remember in the early 1980s, I heard a piece, a single called TVOD, made by a guy called Daniel Miller, who went on to form Mute Records. He's the man behind Depeche Mode and all that 80s synthy pop. And TVOD has the same riff, the same line, the same phrase repeated over and over and over again.
TVOD, TVOD, TVOD.
And it was the first time I'd heard this same line over and over again. Nobody had done it before, as far as I knew.
The experimentalists showed that there can be beauty in randomness, in simplicity, and in repetition, and that meaningful music can be created even by the chance throw of a dice, as Mozart had playfully suggested 200 years earlier. And here, in all probability, is the very, very first performance of a newly created Mozart waltz, composed by BBC 4. And here's a piano we prepared earlier.
Thank you. Is he finished with me? Does that mean? Well, we want an awful lot of palaver for you.